imagination simply contained in the mind? Or does it tap into an unseen world with messages waiting to be told? There is a place where legends cross over into our world, where strange visions and whispers beckon, and superstition takes hold. Step into the Black Cat's shadow.
Welcome back to the Black Cat Shadow. I'm your host, Andy. I guess my other host is...
Hey guys, Phantom Dark Dave.
I guess I didn't want to say where I'm from. I got tired of doing that. I don't know.
Nobody knows where we're from, Andy.
Yeah, so this is our Universal Monsters Series Part 2. And me and Dave are going to be talking about the sequel to The Wolfman, because as you guys know that Universal Monsters Series Part 1, me and Dakota talked about the Wolfman. So, which is, it's interesting. This really is a Wolfman movie. I mean, Frankenstein is only on screen for like 5 minutes of this movie, which is a shame. I mean, if you like started watching this movie thinking you were going to get Frankenstein, equal parts Frankenstein and Wolfman, no, just Wolfman, basically, which is fine with me because I still have not seen any of the Frankenstein movies besides this.
Wait, you've seen the original, right?
No, I have not seen the original Frankenstein yet.
Okay, hey,
it's
right.
My it's what they call the wall of shame or whatever. It's like my It's like my horror blind spot is these old Universal monster movies. I mean, I've seen The Creature from the Black Lagoon, I've seen The Wolfman, and I've seen Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. So
okay, well, that's why we do this is get you some more experience with these Universal monster movies. So eventually we're going to be down to the multiple sequels or the trequels or whatever, all the multiple crossovers that we can do
in the whole timeline of Universal Monsters. This is actually the 5th Frankenstein movie, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, this one comes right after The Ghost of Frankenstein, which it's so weird because it's a direct sequel to The Wolfman. And it's also what happens after Ghost of Frankenstein. And so, as you guys know, in this series, we have the Fright Club podcast doing The Bride of Frankenstein. So we're going to try to do everything we can to not really spoil Ghost of Frankenstein for you. But when we talk about kind of where Frankenstein comes from in this movie and what's going on with him, you're going to get a little bit here and there. But try not to let it ruin it for you because all the movies are definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, going into this without seeing any of the previous Frankenstein movies, I still feel like I was following along with the story pretty well because I think most people, they know the general idea of Frankenstein. Like Frankenstein was a scientist. He was in this big castle. He created a monster, terrorized a nearby village, and they basically got mad and the villagers destroyed Frankenstein and whatever what did they burn? I don't know.
They burned down the windmill.
Okay, I don't really know how all that plays into what we see in this movie. So, but we can definitely you can tell me if I'm getting into spoiler territory for some of the earlier movies. I mean, for me, I don't think this has really spoiled anything, even though because I don't know because I don't feel like there was any major revelations in this movie. I mean, you get Frankenstein. For a little bit, but that's about it. I don't know. So,
well, one thing I want to say too that is really cool about the Universal Monsters and this entire 30s, 40s, and 50s time frame is how many few actors played the different amount of roles. You know what I'm saying? So you have Lon Chaney, Lon Chaney Jr., who is reprising his role as the Wolfman. And he's great, in my personal opinion. I thought he was well invested. He carried it over. He seemed even more into it this time than he was in the original. But Frankenstein, however, who is, like you said, barely in the film, is played by Bela Lugosi. And it's hilarious to me because in the original, Bela Lugosi was cast to play, the monster in Frankenstein, and he didn't want to do it. And then here we are years later, he finally plays Frankenstein. And like I said, this comes right after The Ghost of Frankenstein. And guess what? Lon Chaney, who plays the Wolfman, was Frankenstein's monster in that movie. So it's like they're yeah. And then Bela Lugosi, who plays Frankenstein's monster in this movie, played Igor. So like they just keep handing the torch, and it's like rock paper scissors. Okay, I'm Dracula this time. You know, it's like what's going on behind those curtains, man.
Oh man, could you imagine like something nowadays like? Well, I won't mention that one cinematic universe, but like we'll say like DC.
Okay.
Like if Ben Affleck, one movie he played Batman, and the next movie he played Superman. And
God.
That would be funny.
Well, speaking of that, so originally they were going to do something like that. Like Lon Chaney was going to play both parts in this movie. But they were, like, no, that's a lot of work. So what I've read and what you and I have talked about behind the scenes is, like you said, is Frankenstein is kind of barely in this. And, man, Bela Lugosi was 60 years old playing this role. So even a lot of that time, it's stuntmen and stand-ins.
I saw that. Yeah, that was surprising to me because I couldn't really tell a difference. I think with all that makeup on, the Frankenstein makeup, you really can't tell, like, I mean, on the close-up shots, you can tell, yeah, okay, it's Bela Lugosi, but, like, on the faraway shots, I think it could easily be somebody else, and it probably wouldn't make a big difference. Especially with what he does. Like, unfortunately, like, Frankenstein doesn't do a whole lot in this movie. He just kind of, like, man, what's the word? He just kind of stumbles around with his arms out in front of him, like a zombie, basically. And from what I read was, he was supposed to be blind in this movie. Is that right?
Yeah, it's based off the events in Ghost of Frankenstein, because what happens is they do we might as well talk about it just briefly, just to kind of put it out there, because it's a super old movie. And like you said, I mean, you're not going to get much out of it, knowing or not knowing. It's the experience of watching it. But in that movie, they do a brain transplant because they're like, oh, Frankenstein's monster, who we just tend to call Frankenstein, all we need to do to fix him is give him a new brain, and he'll be A-okay. So they put Igor's brain into him. And that's what kind of makes the transplant makes things go wrong, and then he becomes deaf and blind.
Oh, so he can't hear. Okay.
Right, and so they tried to incorporate that a little bit into this movie, but then they do the whole shenanigans, and that's why they cut out all the speaking parts, because originally he was going to speak, and I was like, man, I don't know, that's kind of weird to have Frankenstein holding a conversation, besides like fire, stuff like that. But yeah. But you know what? I'm not here to talk bad about it, man. I love these old school monster movies. You and I have been talking about it. You love it too. It's definitely a fun experience. I think the biggest conversation was, what do we like better, the Wolfman or the sequel?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough call. I mean, they're both great movies. There is a lot more going on in this movie, even though it's only like an hour and 14 minutes long, something like that. There's still a lot of like plot points happening within the story. It seems like it feels like an epic movie. Like there's this whole like quest thing going on with Lon Chaney Jr. and the Gypsy. Oh man, and the movie starts off with a great scene with some grave robbers. They break into Larry Talbot's tomb. I guess there was a rumor that his money and stuff was buried with him, so they broke into his tomb to try to steal it all. And once they get the tomb opened up, they find like a bunch of wolfsbane like stuffed into the casket on top of Larry Talbot's body. And then when they take out the wolfsbane, that lets the moonlight hit the body, and it's a full moon. It just happens to be a full moon that same night. And so Larry Talbot, he awakens, and he is, and they don't show the Wolfman at this point, but you get a really cool scene of like the arm coming out of the casket and grabbing the grave robber. And so that was a really cool scene. And it just kind of like ends there, like one of them runs away.
I'll pick up right there. So what I love about these movies is, it usually goes one way or the other. You have, similar to like when we talked about in Candyman, where there's murders being committed and either the person is actually doing it and doesn't remember, or the person's going to be framed for it. And what I love about this movie is it's kind of a combination of both, where he's committing the murders, but he does it as he's only the wolf, but he remembers doing it, but then no one believes he's actually doing it. So he's like, the chief inspector, the cops, they find him just kind of passed out on the ground. He's injured. They take him back to the hospital, and he starts to explain what's going on. He gives his identity. They research it, and they call his hometown, and they're like, oh, yeah, we know him. He died 4 years ago. They're like, what? And so once his identity's kind of proven, they think he's crazy. I think they should be like, yep, zombie. We went to his funeral, but no, they're like, oh, he's just a crazy person. And he's like, yeah, I'm a murderer. And so what I love about the whole thing is that he's blatantly telling them to their face, hey, I ripped these people's throats out. I drained their blood. I killed them. And they're like, oh, you're just crazy.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if they, I don't know, I think that their doubts were about his identity. Like, they didn't believe he was really Larry Talbot. But they kind of, they thought that he could have been well, yeah, I don't know. I think they just didn't really believe anything he was saying because, of course, the person that he claimed to be was dead. But then he proves to be what he says he is, as we see in the movie. Yeah, so the whole plot of the movie is Larry Talbot is back alive. He is tormented because he knows that he changes into this wolf man and that he kills people. And so he just wants to die. That's basically his goal. He is like suffering so much in this back and forth between Wolfman and being Wolfman and like just killing people without any, I don't know, with no control. And then he goes into being a man and knowing what he did and having that guilt, just saddled on him. So he goes to look for the gypsy woman. I can't remember her name. It's Maleva or something like that. And he actually finds her. It's the same woman from the first movie.
Same actress.
Yeah, that was cool. I really liked that touch of having her in the movie. One thing I wanted to say though, talking about that first scene, man, I love the sets that they built for these movies. Like it would be something to be able to go to the Universal soundstage during this time and just see these sets like in person. I think that'd be amazing.
Well, yeah, and it proves two things, Andy, besides the fact that they don't make movies like they used to. But one, these movies just look like giant haunted house sets. Like everything was practical. They just built it. And things, when filmed in black and white, always tend to look so much scarier than they really are. And they really become atmospheric. And I'm with you, just seeing the fog going over the tombstones. And you got this mini mausoleum, where he's buried. And even like you said, just the slide of the arm coming out of the grave just creates that tension, that eerie feel, because you see it happening, even though the character who's about to get attacked doesn't see it happening. And, they keep finding Larry. He's waking up in the street. He's waking up in bed, and he's always like beat up and bruised. And you, as an audience, are watching this movie knowing what's going on, and the body count's rising. But the fact that they brought back original actors, and you see the gypsy lady in the beginning, from the original, and then now she's in this movie, and he's coming to her pleading for help because he's like, I still got the sign of the pentagram. It's the sign of the devil, the sign of the wolf. I'm killing people, and all I want to do is die. And he's like, she's like, I don't want to help you. And he's like, look, it was your son, Bela, which is really funny because it was played by Bela Lugosi. Your son, Bela, is the one that turned me into the wolf. You were able to watch him. I just want you to watch over me. And so now you get this bond between them two.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, the relationship that developed between the two. I really felt like they did a good job with those characters, like building that relationship. And it was cool. That's why I think this is such a great sequel to the first Wolfman, because it takes those characters from the first movie and it carries on their story. You see where the story, you see how the story progresses. You see more of these characters, their character arc, I guess, if you want to say. I really like that.
Well, yeah, and because this movie's pretty much broken into 3 acts. And the first act is the resurrection of Larry Talbot, like you just said. And now he wants her salvation, and she's like, I know a guy who can help you. And it just so happens to be Dr. Frankenstein. And so now we're getting the connection of, oh, man. So the guy who's the Wolfman's going to get help from Dr. Frankenstein, and surely he's going to run into the monster, and this is what's going to happen. And so now they take a little journey together, and they travel to the small town where they find out that Dr. Frankenstein is dead.
Yeah, so their plans are pretty much, they're like, well, what do we do now? And that's whenever Larry Talbot, he goes to the castle ruins and he's looking around.
They're looking for like the diaries and stuff, trying to find any notes.
That's right,
on what the doctor had left behind, and they couldn't find anything at that point. But that's whenever that they realized Dr. Frankenstein had a daughter, right?
Yeah, Elsa.
Yeah. And they think maybe she knows where the stuff's at. And she does. And that's great because she's able to help them out. And she's like, oh, you got to look right here. And he's like, I already looked there. And then she goes and she just pulls this little pull string and a little trap door opens up. And hey, look, there's the notes right there.
Yeah. I will say in this movie, I thought that, I don't know, like to me it seemed like they did improve on the Wolfman makeup.
Agreed.
Okay.
Well, yeah, because I remember you weren't too keen in the original Wolfman. You were like, this is such an iconic role, and I expect a little more because, in the original, this is before any really big special effects were out there. The Werewolf of London, which came out even before that movie, was really good, but they did scene switches behind a tree. And so when you had the Wolfman, they just showed the progression kind of like on the feet and then on the hands, and then boom, he's got a full mask of hair on. And in this movie, Larry Talbot in many scenes is still, and they're doing the scene progression on his face, and so you get to see, at least for 1943, some pretty frightening wolf transformations.
Yeah, definitely. And he is a little bit more, like you said, there's a lot of kills in this movie. There's a lot more than in The Wolfman, so he's more vicious, and he's actually like biting people on the neck and stuff like that. Even though, I mean, for, obviously for hardcore horror fans, this is going to be pretty tame still. I mean, you're not going to get like gore or anything like that. This
isn't Saw 27, is that what you're saying? And let's talk about Lon Chaney. I mean, playing the Wolfman, he is a huge guy. The guy's got to be like 6'4". He is towering. He is menacing. And I was so happy to see him back in this role, and the fact that they didn't change him around again. Because like I said, I felt that he was really well invested in his character to a point where, I mean, he was selling it. Like, I believed he really could change into a wolf. And there's a really cool story that's coming together where the police want to arrest him for being a murderer, but then the doctor's saying, no, he's a lycanthrope. He thinks he's a wolf. And they're like, oh, what a poor devil. And so you have the clash coming together, and he's like, well, if any more people die, it's on you. And he's like, well, that's okay. Because he doesn't believe that people are actually dying. The doctor just thinks he's crazy. But then the funny thing that happens is, let's roll into the part at the restaurant. Because they're at the restaurant together, and they're playing music and singing, and there's a whole musical sequence about dying and living forever, and it starts to torment Lon Chaney's character to the point where he has a nervous breakdown.
Yeah, because he definitely does not want to live forever with this curse on his head.
Yeah, it causes him to have a tangent to the point where he runs away, and he ends up, as he goes back to the little castle area, right? And then he falls through.
There's a certain point in the movie where he is like, he's out running in the woods, and like he transforms into the Wolfman, and as the Wolfman runs to the castle ruins, and he falls down into this.
It's almost like a mine shaft. I know it really wasn't, but that's kind of what they were picturing. It was just a little tunnel that he went down, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was like snow and ice down there. It was underground. Yeah.
So then he's just is like going crazy in that little cave or whatever, and then he like knocks himself out or something, and then he like wakes up and he's human again, and that's when he sees something in the ice, and he goes over and busts it out, and it's Frankenstein. And so right away it seems like he's able to communicate with the monster.
Well, yeah, because he used to be the monster.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But the monster's like able to show him where Frankenstein had his like notes, and like not his diary, but like he's
his
able to
laboratory and stuff.
Yeah, he's able to point where if he couldn't see, I don't know. It's like,
well, and that's what they do is they may bring up what it's supposed to be like, but they totally get away from it. And that's something that they talk about kind of behind the scenes and notes in the movie too, is how they kind of bended the rules a little bit between the two movies just to make this plot go forward. Because one thing, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point in time, was this movie was almost thrown together on a whim. Like, they never planned to do a Frankenstein Wolfman movie. They were out of ideas, and somebody just made a joke about it, and they're like, okay, let's do it. Because it's the first time it's ever been done,
Yeah, this is the first crossover movie of the Universal Monsters, so that's kind of cool. The first time that they had two different monsters show up in the same movie.
Exactly. And, one of the biggest plot points of this movie is you're thinking, okay, eventually these two are going to go at it. But right now, they're buddies. You're like, what's going on?
Yeah, they're like best of friends. It's funny.
That's right.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. I was like, okay, so now they're best buds now. But then, like, Frankenstein's monster just disappears for a while, and, like, you don't see him until after they do that musical number in the village. Then he just, like, shows up. I'm like, yeah, where's he been all this time? I don't know. But
It sounds like we're saying that Frankenstein's monster did the musical, like they did a musical number, like, oh, they were singing and dancing, you had Frankenstein and Wolfman arm in arm. But yeah, and that's what we're saying too, is the movie bounces around between Act 1 and Act 2. You get your Wolfman movie, then you get your taste of a Frankenstein movie, and then our third act, we finally start to see what's going on, where the real villain kind of turns out to be the doctor at this point.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, because he gets obsessed with the idea of seeing the full potential of Frankenstein's monster,
right.
Following, because he gets, like you said, they were able to find the diary, the notes, the laboratory, and now he wants to become what Dr. Frankenstein was, because he thinks that Dr. Frankenstein was one of the greatest minds of all time, and even against everybody else's wishes, they're like, no, do not do that. They are talking about reversing the polarity, right, and doing like positive to negative and negative to positive, and basically transfer all of Wolfman's energy into Frankenstein. And what that'll do will finally kill off the Wolfman, which they want, but it will bring the true power to Frankenstein. And if you'd seen the first movie, that's not a good thing.
Okay, so yeah, I didn't really understand what was going on with that whole medical thing at the end. Like, I mean, I understood like trying to drain off the energy of the monster or whoever it was to kill them, I guess, but I guess I didn't understand, like, so he was trying to drain the Wolfman's energy,
right, and put it in and use it to go into Frankenstein's monster. And yeah, BS, but a lot of fun. And just like you said about the sets, I mean, man, definitely an awesome full climatic end sequence in the laboratory, having both of these creatures tied up to these beds and the electric, the bolts going in between both of them, and this doctor's going crazy.
Yeah, no, it was a knockdown, drag out fight there at the end. I mean, they were really going at it. They were rolling around on the ground, and just like the Wolfman was jumping on Frankenstein, and I was surprised that their makeup like held together as good as it did.
That's true, that the headpiece didn't go flying off like a toupee or something. And if that's what you're wanting to see, you do finally get that in this movie. You're like, oh, when are they going to fight? Well, the good news is they do. They get into a scuffle, and it goes on for probably a good 15-minute scene, maybe 10-15 minutes, where they're fighting each other in this laboratory, all along while the laboratory is falling apart. And so, like you said, they're destroying this place. There's running water going everywhere. There's bricks falling everywhere. Like, you got Lon Chaney flying through the air.
Yeah, you don't really get to see who wins, though, because one of the villagers blows up a dam upstream, and it floods the castle. So who knows what happens to the monsters after that.
Sounds like a typical Freddy versus Jason ending. Nobody wins, nobody loses.
Yeah. But I'm in the same camp as you. I like this movie a lot. I think it's a good sequel to The Wolfman. But I definitely still need to see Frankenstein. I want to compare Bela Lugosi and Karloff to see. I mean,
I will try to be as nice as possible, and I respect everyone, but there is no comparison. Like, Karloff rules that role, man. I promise, when you finally get around to seeing that original, you might be like, oh man, like, we should have done a Frankenstein movie.
But yeah, for the short run time, this movie has a lot going on. It definitely kept my attention. It wasn't so much like that it was scary, but I thought it was a good story. I like seeing the continuation of the characters. Like, there was some trivia I saw on IMDb about Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. There was a big rivalry between the two. I guess it said that Karloff was bitter about Lugosi's success with Igor and the Son of Frankenstein, and his own performance is largely ignored, I guess.
Oh, wow.
So Karloff, he was still Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein, right? Or he was still the monster and Son of Frankenstein, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess, and Bela Lugosi played Igor. So I guess, supposedly, Boris contacted his friends at Universal and set out to sabotage Bela's part. In this movie, in the Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, he had the production unjustly edit out all the dialogue off Lugosi's monster role, making Bela's Frankenstein creature appear dumb and his performance thereby inept, since the explanation about his being blind, and thus the reason behind his careful walk, had been deleted. This was one of the many ways Karloff used to destroy Bela's career, since the studio would then use what turned into a somewhat bizarre performance, which was the editor's fault, as justification for not hiring Bela for Universal's future Dracula roles, such as in the following year's House of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
I don't know. Hopefully not. Hopefully those are just rumors, and because I think that Boris Karloff is seen as a great horror actor, like one of the icons of horror, and he's contributed a lot to the horror genre. So I mean, I hope I don't know how he's like personally in his personal life, but I don't know. There seems to be two sides to Boris Karloff, or not two sides. There's a group of people that love him, that are big fans of his, and there's seems to be some people that really don't like him, that think there was a sinister side to him. So I don't know. I don't want to necessarily get into all that, but I thought it was interesting that I kind of came across that while I was researching for this movie.
Yeah, that's something that I didn't actually read up on, but I am a big Karloff fan, and I am a big Lugosi fan, and I would love to think that they can both exist in a perfect world and be their own horror icon. But when you're playing some of the same roles, I mean, you're under the same house. That's gonna happen, unfortunately, and some people just can't take it, man. And it's unfortunate if that's true. But the funny thing and kind of the sad thing is, if you look at the performance, I mean, it does add up, because Bela, usually he knocks everything out of the park that he does. And in this one, he didn't do a bad job. There just wasn't much to it.
Yeah, he just didn't have much screen time, and I don't know. I mean, and it could also be, like studio interference. They didn't like, maybe they didn't like Bell's performance or something, or they...
Well, and he's 60,
Yeah.
I mean...
So, but it's an interesting movie, definitely. It's one of the Universal monster movies. I mean, it's one of those that if you're a horror fan, I think you owe it to yourself to dig into these Universal monster movies and see them all. I definitely want to go through and I want to actually go through and watch them all in a chronological order. I want to see Dracula first, and then go from there.
One thing that I wish we could have got was a crossover from some movies of the 20s, because every time I see Lon Chaney Jr., I think of his dad, Lon Chaney Sr., who is my favorite actor, who was the 1925 Phantom of the Opera. And then I think of Bela, and Bella's great. Bela Lugosi's awesome. I'm just not a huge overall Dracula character fan, right? But when I think about a vampire, I think of Max Schreck from Nosferatu, and I'm like, show me the movie with the Phantom of the Opera and Nosferatu. Oh, dude, I'm in. He's got that look and that appearance, and just imagine, we're supposed to be talking about, Frankenstein and Wolfman, but now all I can think about is Nosferatu in the catacombs of the Paris Opera House. I mean, let's go. Where's that movie?
That'd be cool. I need to watch the original I need to watch Nosferatu again. I've seen it. It's been some years since I've seen it, but
we need to just get a copy of a 4K or a remastered version, because man, so good. But yeah, so overall, I would say we do really like this movie. We highly appreciate it. We do both really recommend it. We just want to put it out there, know what you're getting into. It does help to see original Wolfman first, maybe get a little Frankenstein under your belt, at least maybe the one right before the Ghost of Frankenstein, to see the two processor films. And yeah, I mean, this is a 1940s Freddy versus Jason, basically.
Yeah, just to think about back in those days. Actually, I'm sure that these movies were probably more mainstream than our horror movies today are, I'm sure.
Oh, definitely.
The audience for Frankenstein and the Wolfman and Dracula, those were just regular. I don't want to say horror fans aren't regular people, but it was just
You're just saying not only horror fans were watching these movies.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you, man.
So that's kind of cool to think about, that these Universal monster movies had a wider audience, really. Well,
look at the remakes. I mean, it's unfortunate. They tried to remake The Wolfman, and it was garbage, in my opinion. They didn't, and that's not any of the actors' fault. It doesn't work today.
Yeah.
These movies are definitely a product of their time, and a good one. But you just got to be in the right mind state to be able to appreciate it. And like you said, back then, people were scared out of their wits, man.
There was definitely back in those older days, the black and white days, there's definitely a sense of, a sense of passion towards the art, to where nowadays I think it's more of a business. Obviously it's always been a business, but I think now it's even more about how can we make money. That's basically the bottom line to these any movie that's made now is like, how much money can we make? It's
Right.
not, oh, this would be a cool movie to make. It's how much money will this movie bring in?
Yep. Well, when money doesn't matter, we'll get great movies again.
And that's not to say that there isn't good movies being made nowadays. I think there are some. You just have to kind of look more in the independent sector, I think, to get some really passionate horror filmmakers. And I think even though like looking at like Blumhouse and those really cheap to make horror movies that make them a lot of money, it's like, yeah, they're not the greatest movies, but hey, it's at least it's some horror being released in the theater. I'll go see it.
Yeah, one thing I do want to bring up is we talked about how we both thought this was a really cool story. Well, the guy who wrote this was not new to the game, especially to the horror universe, because he had already written The Invisible Man Returns. He did the original Wolfman screenplay. And so he did The Ape, The Invisible Woman. I mean, the list goes, on and on. Invisible Agent, Son of Dracula. So he was already big with Universal. And so it comes to no surprise that he was able to conjure up a story like this and really make it work. And he was progressive through his entire career up until, he still gets credited for anything that Wolfman pops up in.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, the writing was solid, I feel like, in this movie, definitely. Like, the dialogue was good. Oh, and this is another thing that I saw, that there was a scene in this movie, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, where Frankenstein, like the monster, and Larry Talbot as a human were like in that ice cave, in that snow cave or whatever, having a conversation. But they cut it out because they wanted to delete all of Frankenstein's dialogue. But I guess there was like this, they had this thoughtful conversation, and I thought that would be really interesting to see, and I don't think there's any footage that exists of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, if that movie was filmed today, it would be on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's really sad that when something's lost, it's actually gone forever. Unless somebody knows where it is, or if you have it, let us see it.
It's sitting in some basement of the Universal lot next to London at Midnight.
Oh, gosh. Amazing movie. Thanks for that.
So that'll do it for this episode of our Universal Monsters second series. Stay tuned for the next episode in this series. It's going to be Paranormal Pativity, and he's going to be doing The Mummy's Hand.
Hey, it's Paranormal Pat from the Paranormal Pativity Podcast. I'll be covering the Universal monster movie from 1940, The Mummy's Hand. Make sure to check out my episode along with all the other episodes in this crossover podcast extravaganza. And please go check out my backlog of episodes. You can find me on any platform such as Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, and more. Please go check them out and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at ParanormalPat64. You can also email me at paranormalpat64@gmail.com. Please send me your experiences through the email or Twitter, and I will put them on the podcast. Enjoy.
So expect that between October 14th and the 20th, looks like.
No, Mummy's Hand Job. That's what you said, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
if that movie actually existed, then he would have to do it. But
that'd be some soaked up mummy, let me tell you.
And then after that, you have Back in Time podcast doing Dracula's Daughter, Fright Club doing Bride of Frankenstein, and then last but certainly not least, the first week of November, you have Brian over at Terrible Terror doing Revenge of the Creature. So we definitely look forward to those. And also B-Movie Bros, they did Return of the Invisible Man. That was right before this one, so go back and check that one out if you have not yet. So for October, we are doing our Halloween movie reviews. Dave, what's going on in your neck of the woods? How can people stay tuned with what's going on with you?
Oh, yeah, man. So I exist in two different worlds, part of this Black Cat Shadow podcast where we're kicking butt and talking about horror movies all the time. And then, of course, I'm over at my own podcast, which you are just another part of, and it is the Dave's Pop Culture Podcast, where I talk about anything and everything as long as I'm interested in it. So follow me on Twitter at PhantomDarkDave. Follow Andy here at Black Cat Podcast. You'll see us crossing the streams and everything that happens in between.
You can check out Black Cat Shadow website, www.blackcatshadow.com, where you'll find all of our past episodes on there and most of the links to where you can download them on iTunes, Google Play, whatever. Most of the apps that you listen to, or if you just search on your podcast app, you'll probably find us. I wanted to do a, I don't know what you call it, a shout back to one of our past episodes. Because, with Halloween, it reminds me of haunted houses or haunts that they're called nowadays. And they have progressed to having extreme haunts, and there is one well-known extreme haunt called McCamey Manor, and we did interview the owner, Russ McCamey, last year, so you guys should definitely go check that out, because it's an interesting interview. So, and if you want to send us an email, we'd love to interact with you guys. Our email is blackcatpodcast@gmail.com. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, Horror Amino, just search, you'll probably find us. You'll probably find, if you look at Phantom Dark Dave's Twitter, you'll find us through that. We're at Black Cat Podcast on Twitter. So remember, guys, to take a closer look at the world around you, and you may just find that it is stranger and more mysterious than you thought, especially in the Black Cat Shadow.